Well, hi. I'm Peggy Johnson, Executive Director of the nonprofit Loft Cinema. Happy to have you here this evening. I think it's a different movie that had the line "a failure to communicate," but we were going to wait and show that clip when Dr. Ellsberg was here, and he has not yet quite arrived. But I will proceed to do an introduction, and hopefully he'll get here so we won't have to just sit and wait, but hopefully he's coming soon. Anyway, I love that clip from Dr. Strangelove. That film was the inspiration for the name of Dr. Ellsberg's newest book called Doomsday Machine. And the reference to the Bland Corporation was a clear reference to the Rand Corporation. And I wonder if Daniel Ellsberg was a consultant on this film, because everything in this movie reflects his world. So who was at the event last night on campus? Yeah? So I think tonight will be considerably different. We will be talking about films. I want to thank Valeria Chomsky, who's not here yet, for making all of this possible, and also the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, which has been a partner of ours on so many events over the years. And J.P. Jones is a dean, and his whole team is amazing. And they've just been great communicators and great partners through this event and through many, many others. And I will introduce our guest tonight, even though he's not quite here yet, but he knows who he is, so maybe this will save him the repetition. So our guest is Daniel Ellsberg, who Henry Kissinger once called the most dangerous man in America. Right? That's a good title. Excuse me a minute. So, sorry about that. I was not prepared to do this at this moment. Ellsberg, I'll tell you a little bit about his background. I'm not going to go into all the detail because, as you know, he had an incredibly interesting and complex life and did so many things. But he was a strategic analyst at the Rand Corporation. And in 1967, when he was there, he worked on a top secret report that Robert McNamara asked for. It was a study of the U.S. decision-making process in Vietnam from 1945, the very beginning, through 1968. Ultimately, that study became known as the Pentagon Papers, the 7,000-page study that he copied the entire thing and then made copies of the copy and released it to the Senate and to the New York Times and other papers. And the rest is all history. And well documented in films. When Ellsberg was a consultant to the White House and the Department of Defense in 1961, he drafted Secretary McNamara's plans for a nuclear war, and that's what the Doomsday Machine is about, his new book. So he's now a senior fellow of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. His most recent book is The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, which was published just last year. So tonight we're going to really focus on Daniel Ellsberg's life to some degree as represented in film. His life, his work, his activism, and we're going to look at clips from 5 different films about him and about the Pentagon Papers, and here he is. Right on cue. So Dr. Ellsberg, wait, you can just sit and we're going to watch the clips first. You're on the end there. All right, and then the Chomskys are in the front row center. Okay, yeah, that's great. Anywhere, it's fine. Well, this is awesome timing. So, Dr. Ellsberg, you didn't have to listen to your intro again about who you are and what you've done. So maybe it saved you that experience. So anyway. So tonight we're going to talk about through the lens of several films about Ellsberg, about the Pentagon Papers, and we'll touch on how film can be a history lesson for the public, for better and sometimes for worse, and the impact of these films on Ellsberg's legacy and also on other people like Snowden, who said he was inspired to do what he did by seeing the film The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg, and the Pentagon Papers. So it seems like film is wrapped up in who Daniel Ellsberg is. So we're going to hopefully focus on that. And we're going to start with clips from 5 films. This was a really hard process to pick these clips, and I could have picked 100 from each film, but this will give you a brief little glimpse at the films, and then we'll talk with Dr. Ellsberg. Thank you. So help me welcome Dr. Daniel Ellsberg to the stage. That's great. Thanks. Nice to see you. So, what do you think watching those clips?
You know, a couple, or at least one I hadn't seen before.
Which one is that? Was it Nixon,
the name, sir?
Oliver Stone film?
No, there was one, somebody was playing with all the blue volumes around the...
Oh, you know, that's a made-for-TV movie with James Spader called The Pentagon Papers.
It had a
2003.
Oh, okay. Well, all right.
I know.
I didn't remember that particular...
I watched it, and I wasn't sure I was going to use it, but it was so good. I mean, it was it was more accurate narratively than the Oliver Stone film or the Spielberg film, I felt, in terms of, you know.
Which was more accurate, you thought?
The made-for-TV movie. I thought the Oliver Stone movie was really fun.
No, I remember I'd forgotten that scene, I guess. The made-for-TV movie actually was done without my involvement at all. In fact, I learned later that the people had, in their contract, had to declare that they would not be in any contact with me.
Really?
And that was the case from beginning to end. My memoir, Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers, had not come out yet.
Oh, okay.
And I think they were afraid that I would kibitz, which I would have, and maybe even ask for money, which I might have. Actually.
And you should have.
So, and actually the film was all the dialogue was made up. None of it was accurate. In fact, I mean, none of it was very true to life. And in fact, virtually every scene had some sort of major inaccuracies.
Really?
However, the overall feeling was really quite good. It was in favor of whistleblowing. I gave it to people, you know, show them, see it was a good movie. And I sort of said it was like since you're asking about film here, it was like the old Kodacolor negatives, you know, where the colors are reversed when you look at the negative. So all the colors were backwards, but the overall scene, the framing is accurate, you know, the silhouette and sort of. So it was,
well, I had no idea.
Movie,
that's
but
very
they
interesting.
didn't, it wasn't actually very accurate. And
But James Spader looked good.
And it did. Yeah, no, James Spader, that's fine. And Reese, Matthew Reese, of course, in the end, as I've always said, it's nice to be played by someone who looks much the way I did at the time, only better.
Well, I read an interview that you did, or a conversation between you and Edward Snowden, where you talked about who had portrayed. He was portrayed by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and you were portrayed by Matthew Reese. And you, yeah, you discussed that. The another thing you discussed was how many more people see narrative films like The Post.
Yeah.
Even Nixon, than the documentaries.
The documentary is quite accurate.
Right. The documentary, The Most Dangerous Man in America, was a film we showed here in 2009, and it's excellent. Yeah.
So incidentally, you know, the film is accurate, and The Most Dangerous Man in America.
Right.
And in a way, the new book that I've just put out, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, is kind of a complementary, I should say, to that book, because it gives the backstory. At the time that I was copying the Pentagon Papers, the Vietnam Papers, I was also copying as many or more, probably 8,000 pages of material on nuclear weapons. I don't know if you've seen my book, or have you?
I have your book. Yes, I do.
Have you read it?
I have not read the whole thing. I have read Secrets, but I have not read the other one. And
well,
Secrets has a lot of the stuff about nuclear war in it,
well,
too.
if you've read the beginning, then you know that I was copying that. At the time of of the documentary,
Right.
I was still keeping that secret that I had copied all of these nuclear documents, which I won't go into the story now, but which got lost actually in the course
It's a
of my
great
trial
story.
by my brother who was keeping them for me. And he had buried them somewhere in a hurricane, scattered them around where he had been. So I wasn't able to put that out. So something in the back of Nixon's mind was the fear, with good reason, that I had knowledge of his nuclear threats against North Vietnam, and which really never have become public, although there is documentary record, but long after the events. We don't have the Pentagon Papers of the Nixon era, actually, only very partial documentation of the Nixon era, and not the kind of complete thing that the Pentagon Papers revealed. And of course, that's true of all of our later involvements, Afghanistan, Iraq. We don't have the Pentagon Papers of those. And but in the case of Nixon, he did know that I had copied many nuclear documents, and he feared that I knew of his nuclear threats. And I did know, but I didn't have documents on that. But he was not just paranoid in feeling that he had to keep me quiet about those. That's of course not represented in any of these films, because none of them really knew that. I told the Post people about that, but it was too late in their production process. In fact, they weren't inclined to put anything like that in.
I read somewhere that you were, that they didn't put the fact that your daughter was involved in, because
Well,
they didn't think
no,
it was
in
believable?
fact, he was very, Spielberg was very taken by that story, and I understand they actually filmed it. They asked me, I said, please be sure that my daughter's hair is black, because in the television film, they had a scene of my daughter in that scene. I'll tell you, and they had her with blonde hair, and she was upset by that. But that was a scene in which, on one night, the police came to the door, and because actually the woman whose advertising agency that was, Linda Siné, now Resnick, had turned the key the wrong way and turned on an alarm in the police headquarters. So the police arrived, and they found my son at the Xerox machine. He was 13, and I was collating, actually, and Mary, who was 10 then, was cutting top secret off the top and bottoms of the pages with the scissors. And Spielberg loved that scene, but in the end, what he said to me was, when they cut it out, he said, it was too incredible. I would have had to spend too much time building up to it and explaining what they were doing there, and so, which I haven't told here. But, so he had Tony Russo cutting the top secret off in the movie.
Right. That's funny. So, what do you think about Edward Snowden? I mean, he's a whistleblower. You're a whistleblower. I mean, how do you compare your reality of your situation with his?
All right. First, he's a hero of mine. He's a friend of mine. I spent a couple days with him in Moscow talking to him, but also I've spent many hours on chat logs, encrypted chat logs with him, and I feel I know him quite well at this point, and I like him very much. At the same time, I can say I identify with him, and with Chelsea Manning, very much so. These are three people, very, very different in background, in age, and experience, and everything. And yet I identify more with Chelsea and with Edward Snowden than anybody else on Earth, because they faced the same issues I did. They took essentially the same chances. And they paid a much higher price than I did in the end. Chelsea, 7 years in prison, 10 and a half months in solitary. Ed Snowden, exiled for life, I would say. I don't think he can ever come back here. And with a threat of death, really, for the rest of his life, essentially. I escaped that. Nixon had it in mind for me, 12 felony counts, 115-year possible sentence. And, in fact, there were occasions when he brought 12 Cuban Americans up from Miami with orders to incapacitate me totally. And I said to the prosecutor, William Merrill, who informed me of this, their prosecutor, what does that mean? Kill me? And he said the words were, from the Oval Office, to incapacitate you totally. He said, but you have to understand, these guys, who were all agents of the CIA, Bay of Pigs veterans, these guys never use the word kill. They say, incapacitate, terminate with extreme prejudice, neutralize. They use euphemisms, but they don't say kill. I think he thought that they were meant to kill me. My own guess is, looking at the timing of it, that they wanted to keep me silent for a few weeks, really silent. I don't think they meant to kill me, although one of them said, Bernard Barker, Macho Barker, that my job was to break both his legs. But that wouldn't have silenced me. I think that was the job of one person, and they really wanted to do something to my mouth or something, because I was mouthing off about the fact that he was about to mine Haiphong and renew B-52 bombing of North Vietnam. And what I didn't know was that he was discussing with Kissinger, not shown in any of these films here, but we have it on the tapes, which I've heard, the use of nuclear weapons against North Vietnam at that time. And they were afraid I knew that and would reveal that. On the tape, he's saying, actually, here's the dialogue. He says, what did we kill in Laos? And Kissinger says, 15,000, 20,000. He said, and if we hit the dikes, and Kissinger says, 150,000 would mean, he said, no, I'd rather use the nuclear weapon. You got that, Henry? And Kissinger says, I think that would be just too much. He said, nuclear bomb, that's too much for you, Henry? I just want you to think big, for Christ's sakes. This is what I listened to on the tape in my kitchen to get it transcribed down. And they were afraid that I would. That's what made me dangerous. Mm-hmm. What made me dangerous was that I would reveal that they were threatening and preparing for nuclear war against North Vietnam, and the American public would not approve of that. So I had to be silenced in one way or another.
Before you got here, we showed a short scene from Dr. Strangelove, which was the scene, I believe, that kind of inspired your title for the book, The Doomsday Machine. Yeah. Where they talk about the need, they had to make it because they couldn't keep up, and it was cheaper to do that, even though it was a really bad idea than
You're talking about the Doomsday Machine.
Yeah, in the movie. And
yes.
You know, the movie, watching the movie fresh after studying so much about you, were you a consultant on that film?
Actually, some of my colleagues were directly consultant. As a matter of fact, since you asked that, nobody's asked me that. I was asked by Adam Yarmolinsky, the assistant to Secretary McNamara. I got a call at the Rand Corporation, and he said, Stanley Kubrick has said he may show us the rushes, the rough cuts of the Dr. Strangelove, and we can go over it, maybe. And if we would, we hear you're the expert on command and control. I said, well, I'm one of them. And he said, we'd like you to look over the rushes. And sure, but Kubrick changed his mind, and he did not show that. But he did, in fact, consult quite a bit with Herman Kahn and with my mentor, Albert Wolstetter. And Kahn, of course, his words are quoted in Dr. Strangelove quite a bit, And he thought he should get a cut for that. Like they were worried that I might ask on the FX movie. And so Kahn said, well, look, you're quoting my words, and the character is based on me in part, and with Henry Kissinger, right, and Edward Teller and Werner von Braun. It's kind of a composite. But so he said, come on, I ought to get it. And Kubrick had to explain to him, it doesn't work like that. We didn't give him any money. But the concept of the Doomsday Machine was Herman's idea. And it was not something he was recommending. On the contrary, it was a system that would destroy all life on Earth fairly automatically under various conditions, such as an attack on the U.S., or it could be something narrower than that, whatever, or broader, whatever you wanted. You'd wire it up to a computer, and it would destroy life on Earth. And the advantage of it was, by the way, that it would be much cheaper than the Strategic Air Command, because you could put bombs in this country or in the ocean that would spread radioactivity around the world, do something that would kill everybody, but you didn't have to truck thermonuclear warheads across the pole or the oceans thousands of miles away to targets there. And so it could be very cheap. But Herman said, nevertheless, no such system has been built or ever will be built. It kills too many people, everybody actually. And so it won't happen in 59, 56. He was wrong. It did exist. an expensive form of it, the Strategic Air Command, which the Joint Chiefs had estimated would kill, if we sent it over to Russia, about 1 billion people. Out of 3 billion, that leaves 2 billion, or as Edward Teller would have said, the glass 2/3 full. But because Teller had said, you can't with his, he was the father of the H-bomb, you can't kill with his baby the H-bomb, he said, more than 1/4 of the Earth's population, the glass 3/4 full here. And actually that was wrong, because what they learned 20 years later was that the cities we would burn with those bombs, by our own bombs, command and control, centers in the cities, air defenses in the cities, air bases in the cities. The cities would burn, and the bombs, the thermonuclear weapons, would loft the smoke from that, perhaps 150 million tons of black smoke, into the stratosphere where it wouldn't rain out. This is true today and was true then, but we didn't know it. Nobody had looked at the question of what the smoke would do. They looked at other effects of the bomb, but actually this would have been the biggest effect, because the cities burning would provide, even if they'd been evacuated, which Herman was in favor of for threat. We'll evacuate the cities, and said, look, we can hit you, you can't hit us. The cities alone, the smoke, without people in them, would have provided this smoke that would have gone around the globe very quickly, and this is still true, and blocked most of the sunlight, 70% of the sunlight. The temperatures on the Earth would be unlike any seen since the last ice age. And lakes would freeze, rivers would freeze, but all harvests would be killed around the globe. And people would starve. The worldwide supply of food is about 60 days, concentrated in some countries like our own and a few others. So we'd last a few months longer than the others. But within a year, our own plans, without considering even Russian or Soviet retaliation, would starve to death nearly everyone on Earth. So our plans, on which I had worked personally in 1961 and 62, without knowing this, had they been carried out, would have led to the death of nearly everyone. Not quite everyone, as in Herman's scheme, because Alan Roebuck and Bryant, who've done studies on this recently, say that perhaps as much as 1% of the population of the world would still survive eating fish in Australia on the shores, and mollusks in perhaps and New Zealand. But 98 or 99% of people would be gone. And that is true today with our larger options, and it's true with Russia. So we have these two doomsday machines, coupled, it's close enough to everybody to be called a doomsday machine, I would say, and they are readied for preemption, for striking second first, people say. If we have an alarm that missiles are on the way, our ICBMs are ready to be launched within minutes. And they rehearse this every day, launching these missiles before they are destroyed on the ground. These missiles have been obsolete for half a century by any standards, because the submarine missiles, which cannot be targeted like this, are more than enough to cause nuclear winter and kill everyone without the ICBMs. But the ICBMs are about to be modernized in both the US and Russia at great expense. When I say it would be worth that much money to get rid of them, they are lightning rods for attack, preemption on both sides. They are the hair triggers to the doomsday machines. And it's outrageous and incomprehensible, practically, that we are allowing these things to exist. Even if you did preserve some nuclear weapons, like North Korea, as a deterrent, say, they have 10 to 20 weapons. We have 4,000, and we used to have 10,000. When, as Herbert York of Livermore Laboratory once said, how many does it take to deter an attack? Well, one. He said, he was the director of Livermore Labs, one of the two nuclear weapons design labs. He said, maybe 10. He said, maybe 100, but closer to 1 than 100. Well, in the late 60s, we had 37,000 weapons. And the Russians, a little later, had 40,000. So together there was some over 70,000 of these weapons in the world. We come back to York's notion. North Korea has between 10 and 20, let's say. India, Pakistan have about 100 each. But I'm saying this has been a mad pursuit for 70 years, essentially. And what Dr. Strangelove, as I realized when I came out of watching it in the afternoon, my boss in the Pentagon, a friend of mine, we went to see it in the afternoon on the feeling that it was our business, and we came out of that feeling that was a documentary. Everything in that film could have happened. We even felt we could recognize the people.
I thought it was interesting when we watched the clip when Dr. Strangelove rolls over in his wheelchair and says, "I was commissioned by the Bland Corporation." That's pretty close.
It's an obscure, reference.
Yes.
An inside joke.
But it is, having watched it recently, because I knew I was going to interview,
I've
it
seen it
does
many
seem
times.
very.
It's very timely. It's very, and you have to say, this is very accurate. Many people said at the time, "Oh, this couldn't happen. They wouldn't allow this to happen." Wrong. For example, when I say it was a documentary, there was a very esoteric point in it. When the planes are sent off by the rogue general, who could have done that, the codes for sending these things off have always been held much more widely than the White House or the Joint Chiefs. We have never allowed it to be the case that one bomb on Washington could cripple our retaliation. And the same thing is true in Moscow. And I suspect it's true in Korea, that a bomb on Pyongyang killed Kim Jong-un. I'm sure he has made the same arrangements we have to assure there will be retaliation. And that means that the order for that has to be possible to be given at lower levels than the higher. Well, Eisenhower had made that available to all the theater commanders, and they had delegated to others as well. So the fact that this general, I think he's called in the film Jack D. Ripper, if I'm not mistaken,
Exactly.
sends off the planes. Yes, a base commander could do that. And then the thing that seemed very implausible to people was once he sent them off, there is no coded, authenticated message to bring them back. Well, that's a theatrical device. See, a little problem here. That was the way it was for many years. There was no stop code. And that was a very highly classified kind of thing. And I thought, how could they have gotten onto that? And it turns out that the original author of that, a man named Peter Bryant, who had been an RAF officer, which meant apparently they had the same arrangement, that, no stop code. Of course, that was for planes. Send missiles off, there's no stop code once they're sent. And there have been, in fact, a number of false alarms, both in the US and Russia, where it got to a high level, we're being attacked, we're under attack, like the Hawaiian thing months ago,
Terrifying.
where that was just at a low level in Hawaiian. But there have been many alarms which got to high levels. One in 1993 after the Cold War in Moscow, where Yeltsin was presented with a computer to decide whether to launch weapons. There was a missile on its way either to to set off command and control. The simple way to look at it might have been headed at Moscow. It was a Norwegian weather rocket, a satellite they were sending up. But it looked like something from a Trident submarine in the North Sea that might be coming at Moscow. And Yeltsin, during the day, was being asked at this last moment, do we respond right away or not, or before we get hit? And he waited long enough, fortunately, that it was clear that it wasn't going to hit them, or it would have already. So we're still here. That's why we're here. If he had responded differently, or if Brzezinski, working for President Carter, had responded differently at certain points, and if a couple of men, Russians actually, had decided not to make the decisions they did at the front, we simply wouldn't be here. We would have, the older people here would have starved to death long ago.
You use the word lucky a lot when you talk about
Well,
how
this is
we've
luck, yeah, right.
been 70 years and nothing has.
Yeah, it's been essentially almost a miracle that we are still here, I would say, after these 70 years. One could look at it and say, well, 70 years, hasn't happened, you know, apparently it's all is very safe. And as I've said to my wife, Patricia, recently, if I only knew what other people knew about this history, I wouldn't be worried either. It's been a long time, nothing's happened. But I know about the times we've used nuclear weapons, and I'll come back to that, and the accidents and the false alarms. I know that history very well. It's impossible, I think, to look at that and not realize, and not feel, regard, that it's been almost a miracle, a secular miracle, that, I would say, that we're still here. And could it be another 70 years? Well, yes, it's possible. It's been 70 years, could be another 70 years. I think that would take another miracle. I think it's very unlikely unless we change course. If we stay on this course, good, it'll be a miracle. Now, fortunately, miracles do happen. No one foresaw the fall of the Berlin Wall as of, let's say, 1983, that in 5 years, 6 years, that would be gone. No one foresaw that I know of that Nelson Mandela would be president of, actually, given these films, with what I knew in 1972-3, that war wasn't going to be over while Nixon was in office. And Nixon was elected in a landslide in 72, a year after I had put out the Pentagon Papers. And the same year that Woodward and Bernstein had made all of their revelations, essentially, he was reelected in a landslide. I would say at that point, and that year was the heaviest bombing at the end of the year, after the election, after Kissinger had said, peace is at hand, which was the first time, by the way, trying to hear Dr. Strangelove, Kissinger, he had never been allowed to be on television and audio at the same time. Almost nobody knows that. There were pictures of him, no sound. Or there was sound, but no pictures. Nobody wanted to know that the man closest to the president had such a thick German accent. And the one time they allowed him then to say was just before the election, when he said, peace is at hand, knowing that there was the likelihood of what did happen, the heaviest bombing in human history, a couple months later in the Christmas bombing. So at that point, I said the chance that the war will be over in 75, which would require Nixon to be out of office before that, was what? Zero. What could it be? More than zero. And if you knew that Nixon, as I did, that Nixon intended to renew the bombing after the Paris Accords as soon as our troops were out and keep the bombing going. So there you have something like a miracle right then. Couldn't have been foreseen. I didn't go to prison for 115 years or 30 years. That was essentially miraculous. And it was no example to Snowden or Chelsea or anybody else. Look, you know, you can put out classified material and you won't go to prison. I would never have encouraged anybody to use my example because of getting away with it, because that was virtually miraculous. It was unforeseeable. But it did happen, and the war did end. And I'm mentioning that to say, is it likely that we will escape this fate of the doomsday machine? No, it's not likely. It's unlikely. And it's unlikely that we will escape the consequences of our fossil fuel burning and the CO2 in the atmosphere. And the horrific, unlikely, but it's not impossible. It's a low likelihood, and I think that our efforts can make the difference between very unlikely and a little less unlikely. And is that worth, for a person like Snowden, permanent exile, 7 years in prison, life in prison, even death? Yeah, of course. Of course. To improve that chance is, of course, worth risking your life. So that's the message I have.
So I looked through the audience. This is yours. Well,
I know it's yours.
okay. All right. You know my. Oh, we're sharing water. I like that. So Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara created this study on Vietnam for the purpose of writing, quote, an encyclopedic history of the Vietnam War. He wanted to leave a written record for historians to prevent policy errors in future administrations. That's what I have. My research says. Would anything like that happen today? Is there that kind of curiosity or interest in history?
amazingly enough, despite that exposure of that history, which he did not foresee, McNamara, he thought it was for people inside the government in later years. People did continue to make studies, actually, and I'll tell you something. Actually, a suggestion I made for a leak that is actually I'm very proud of, and if only a few people know it, but it has been in print. I was at a conference of journalists at one point a few years ago, and I said, I'm sure that Exxon has made studies of the effects of their fossil fuel burning on the climate. They would want to know. That was from my experience in a secret bureaucracy. They will want to know, and they would have it, and they will have those studies. And if you search for them, you may have some chance of getting them out. And about 2 years later, a couple of years later, a guy from what they call Climate News, I think it was called, wrote me, and he said, I heard you say that, and I was hoping that nobody else at that conference had noticed that. And he said, then you said it again the next day at another workshop. And again, I was crossing my fingers because when I went back to work, he said, I put a team to work on this. And it was more than a year before they got a breakthrough on this. And at the end, they got an engineer, a scientist, who said, yes, the studies existed. I worked on them. And they eventually got the studies. And those studies are the basis for the New York attorneys, U.S. attorney in New York, to be holding hearings now, forcing, and many cases against Exxon for having defrauded their stockholders and the public. They had, in fact, done studies that showed exactly what they were doing to the climate and that it would, the effects it would have on the earth. And we'll see what comes of that. Nothing may come of it, but it is known now. And then, by the way, when they got the studies, they then said, wait, enough of this. And they stopped the studies, kept them secret, and, by the way, began funding institutions whose whole purpose was to deceive the public on this subject, put out disinformation on the climate issue. And that's the way it goes. Well, coming right now, let me say that I'm certain, and when I say that, I should say at 87, I know that when I'm certain, I'm often wrong. Doesn't work that way. But in that context, I feel very confident that there are written studies at every level of classification in the government right now on the disastrous effects of war with North Korea. What it would mean that even a little non-nuclear attack on their missile sites or their test sites would lead, and we would predict it, to retaliation by Kim Jong-un that we would then retaliate to with this fire and fury and so forth, and we would have the first two-sided nuclear war ever. And I'm certain that those are the estimates. When I hear Secretary of Defense Mattis say, as he has said, we would be a disaster, he said before he was secretary and even since he was secretary. I know he knows this, but he's not just dreaming that up. He knows that on the basis, I am certain, of classified studies that have been done of this. And what I'm saying is anybody who has access to those studies right now, and there must be 1,000 people, maybe many more, I would say to them, don't do what I did. Don't wait till the bombs are falling on North Korea, or thousands have died, or 1 million, before you consider in your heart very seriously making those studies available to Congress and to the public simultaneously. Not just Congress, which could bottle them up, as they have totally bottled up the 6,000 pages of the torture report that Senator Feinstein, when she was chairman, said should be out, but she couldn't get it out, she felt, without the CIA's approval. Now, wait a minute. The CIA doesn't have a veto on the acting chairman of the Intelligence Committee.
Right.
But what it means is, if I put it out, they would refuse to give me any more classified lies or whatever they do. And I wouldn't have any chance of getting this. So, and I would be censured, as Gravel was on the verge of being censured for what he put out. He expected to be censured, and he was just saved by Mike Mansfield, the Senate Majority Leader, from censure or possibly even expulsion. So she would face that. or Ron Wyden or Mark Udall at that time, and I was urging Mark Udall to do precisely that. I have no question, if I had had access to that 6,000-page torture study, I would have put that out, or Snowden or Chelsea Manning would have. And I'm saying right now, James Mattis, and if not him, his aide or his secretary or 1,000 other people should put out those studies right now and say an attack on this nuclear weapon state should be off the board. It is not a threat we are making. We've got to deal with this problem by other means other than attacking a nuclear weapon state. For the first time, we've threatened to do so since the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which I participated 55 years ago. Number of presidents have made threats since then, secretly and some publicly, against non-nuclear weapon states, which would be a one-sided nuclear attack, like our attack on Hiroshima or Nagasaki, against a non-nuclear. Bad enough, but not a two-sided war. Against North Korea, you'd get a two-sided war. And it would not cause nuclear winter. It would not kill everybody. They don't have enough cities to burn to cause this smoke effect and destroy all life. They don't have enough weapons. They've 10 to 20 to do it to us, to cause that. They can't even do what India and Pakistan can do, which is to put up enough smoke, not as much as we can, but enough smoke to block about 7% of the sunlight instead of 70%. Shorten harvests, shorten growing seasons, delete some harvests and shorten growing seasons, and starve about 2 billion people out of 7 billion. 2 billion. Well, North Korea can't do that yet. It would be millions, 1,000 times less, not billions, but it would be more violence than the world has ever seen in a day or a week or a month. And that should not be something we are threatening, preparing, and I'm sure that Mattis will, in fact, urge against that. I feel that with Mattis, from what he said and from the nature of the situation. But if he's ordered to do it, well, people have said, will Mattis or let's say Kelly or Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, obey an illegal order or disobey an illegal order? Well, they've just been tested on that. Mattis has just carried out an illegal order to attack Syria that couldn't be more illegal under the UN Charter. It's a crime against the peace. Whatever the excuses for it, we had no security. It's not a self-defense. We had no Security Council ruling in favor of that. It was flatly illegal. I think Mattis's excuse for doing that is a pretty good one, very unusually. Because if he'd refused, he would have been fired immediately. Somebody else would be put in. John Bolton, the new security assistant, who, by the way, is much scarier than Henry Kissinger. So talk about Dr. Strangelove. He is in the White House right now, John Bolton. And then what do we say about our president? But our president and Bolton both wanted a much broader attack in Syria. Now, you can't make a broader attack without attacking Russian bases. So Mattis pulled off something of a tour de force. He carried out an attack that killed no Russians, no civilians, as far as we know, and no plume of chemical weapons, meaning almost certainly there was no chlorine at those bases. Well, that was a virtuoso performance. It's almost impossible to do that in Syria. Very good. If he'd resigned and not carried out that illegal act, a much more dangerous illegal act would almost surely have happened, and we'd be at war with Russia. But now go to North Korea. It's not good enough to have just a little attack against that nuclear state instead of a bigger attack. Either one gets you a two-sided nuclear war. So Mattis should not just resign and not just refuse and not just resign. If that becomes a live, immediate probability, which would be sometime after this summit, the summit puts that off. I hope it will be successful. But if it's not successful, and we get close to carrying out the fire and fury, then Mattis or somebody else should not just resign, he should do what I wish I had done in 64 myself, or 61, what I didn't do for years after, till 69, 71. And that is go public with this opposition, say this must not happen, say it to Congress and the world, and with documents that will show it, and do what he can to avert that disaster.
So I know that nobody really cares about this, but I'm going to ask anyway. Donald Trump is president, and you have written about the madman theory, and especially in terms of the fact that the madman wasn't technically insane, but was threatening to do insane things. So what do you think about what's going? I mean, how could you have ever imagined somebody like this being president, and how do we all collectively sleep at night?
Well, he is unusual. I'm not going on to that. We do have a strange president here.
Oh, you are master of the understatement.
And
I say.
You could even say his love is rather strange when you hear some of his accusers. But but the threats he's making are not unusual. They didn't start with Donald Trump. Nearly every president has in fact used nuclear weapons in the way that you use a gun when you point it at someone's head in a confrontation, whether or not you pull the trigger. And if you get your way without pulling the trigger, that's the best use of the gun in most people's. We've done that over and over, often secretly. As I said, Nixon. Now, Trump has been compared with Nixon, who revealed later that he had a madman theory, that yes, using nuclear weapons would be seen by the world as mad, even though it would not be a two-sided use. But it would kill too many Vietnamese if you did that. Be a bad precedent. It would have been seen as mad, although it's not like using them against North Korea or Russia.
Right.
It's like using them against Iraq or Iran, who don't have nuclear weapons, as presidents have threatened to do. So Trump is doing that, and of course, he looks like somebody who might really carry this out, more often. I think other presidents, some of them have been bluffing, clearly bluffing. Others, I don't think were bluffing. And really, the threat we've made in NATO to launch a first use, and NATO still is based on this policy, to initiate nuclear war against Russians in Europe is a threat of what we used to think was killing 1 billion people, but it now turns out the whole population of the world. But even going back to the billion, it's a threat to carry out a mad action. So essentially, we've been basing our policy on a madman theory with every president since, shall I say Truman? Maybe not, because Truman lived in a world with a monopoly, where he had a monopoly of nuclear weapons from 45 to 49. And then he used them in Korea by saying that they were on the table, every option was under consideration. That is a use of the weapon, but it's not quite the same as dropping it. So he didn't do that. Eisenhower did threaten to do that very seriously in Korea, secretly, and that's what Nixon was drawing on. He said he was following the great general. He had been vice president at that time. So that was the model he used. And then President Eisenhower had used that threat in the Quemoy Islands case and a number of other cases. So Nixon learned it from Eisenhower. By the way, Eisenhower is thought of with some basis. We think very nostalgically of him, a very uncle-like figure, or grandfather or something, and no nuclear wars indeed. When Eisenhower took office, Truman bequeathed him a little over 1,000 fission weapons, atomic weapons of the kinds that destroyed Nagasaki. That was enough, we now know, and they were targeted on cities. That was enough to give us nuclear winter. So had there been a war, saying arising out of the 1948 Berlin crisis, or later, again, I keep saying, but we wouldn't be here. That was 1,000 when Eisenhower came into office. When he left office, there were 23,000 weapons in the arsenal. When Kennedy well, he was killed in 63, but by 67, we had 37,000 weapons of this. So this, cancer-like growth, and we're talking now about thermonuclear weapons in most of them, which Truman didn't have. First tested in 1954 in a droppable form, a solid fuel, H-bomb. And, if I asked here, in this very, I suspect, select audience in many ways, how many people here feel you know the difference between an A-bomb and an H-bomb? Interesting. Look around. I see 15 hands, maybe. How many do not? Okay, that's a much larger number, right? The H-bomb that was tested in 54 was 1,000 times the yield of the Nagasaki bomb, which had killed 58,000 people when it was dropped. The Nagasaki bomb was 1,000 times more powerful in yield than the largest bomb of World War II. By the way, Trump, in his, Make America Great Again, used a bomb in the Middle East that was called the mother of all bombs, as another acronym name, that was 20 tons. And they were saying this is the biggest bomb there ever was of high explosive. That's not true, because that was a bomb used by the RAF in World War II. But that's 20 tons of high explosive. Nagasaki, a Nagasaki bomb, various figures, 18 to 20 kilotons. That's 20,000 tons of TNT. Every H-bomb, of which we had over 10,000, has a Nagasaki-type bomb as its trigger, as its detonating cap. The people who raised their hands didn't know the difference. Here's a simple way of seeing the difference. The Nagasaki A-bomb, the atomic bomb, is the percussion cap, the detonating cap of an H-bomb, which can be 1,000 times more powerful. And that's what has been the bulk of our arsenal ever since. So we have actually reduced that since the end of the Cold War, our arsenals by 85%. That gets us down to about 4,000 each, but 1,500 on alert rather than thousands. 85%. Still far more than enough to cause nuclear winter and kill everyone. Actually, to make a real difference in the war, you have to get down to about 100 or 200, like India and Pakistan, or China roughly has about 300. You have to get in that neighborhood, down to the others. You make a difference. Above that, it doesn't make any difference. You could double it, and it wouldn't make much difference. Or you could cut it in half. I was just figuring on an envelope today. Actually, people do that from Rand. They do make calculations back of an envelope. And I was thinking another 85% would get us down, I forget my figure, but it was about 150. Down to a reasonable level. We've come down 85%, come down another 85%, and we're now down in the area where we might not kill everyone. If we don't do that, you've got nuclear winter. So, it's Kubrick felt he had to present this in the form of a mad comedy somehow. It was just too impossible to believe otherwise. It's like Spielberg feeling, I can't put on the screen a 10-year-old girl cutting Top Secret, off the top. It's too incredible. It happened, but it looks crazy. Okay, this is a different kind of craziness. And it's the one we're living with. What the people in Hawaii experienced a couple of months ago was the existential feeling that everything they knew, everything was going to go away within 30 minutes or 15 minutes. Well, that's the way we've all been living without knowing it for the last 50 years and more. And they just had that experience. Now, there have been people in the White House who've had the experience at 3 a.m. that was about to happen. And they were the ones with their fingers close to the metaphorical button.
Right. So what do you make of Twitter and social media and how that impacts or makes this situation even more dangerous? Or how do you think it
Social media
impacts?
makes it more dangerous?
Or does it?
I don't know how to.
I mean, does
how
a
to say that.
presidency by Twitter?
Well,
You know.
my friend Noam Chomsky was telling me this afternoon that, what was it, 70%, first of all, 40%, let me get it right, 50% I think of Republicans, if I got it right,
Okay.
do not believe there is any climate change. And 70% believe either, including that there's no climate change or that it's no man-made climate change, that we have no effect on it. Well, that's a delusion. See, they are living in a, now, it is also the case, hardly any of them, anybody here, even here, know about the nuclear winter aspect. You know. It's based on the same climate models, and there's just as much of a scientific consensus about the nuclear, among experts, environmental experts, of the nuclear and the climate. So when you say social media, I can say social media hasn't informed these people,
Yeah.
and neither have the mainstream media, the old hard media.
Right.
Are they impermeable? Is there no way to get through them? Well, we haven't found out how, and it hasn't been done. Neither of the candidates, to my knowledge, in the last campaign, mentioned climate change. If I'm wrong, tell me. They certainly didn't spend any time on it, but it wasn't an issue.
Right.
Nuclear weapons were not an issue. Hillary Clinton was as committed to carrying out the current expansion and modernization of our nuclear forces as Trump, and she had inherited that from Barack Obama. There was essentially, it was not a campaign issue. And these are the two existential issues that we're facing us today. And the press in general doesn't report on things that the parties don't disagree on.
Right.
Basically, they just report things where there's a controversy of some sort. Well, I would hope that, it would be great if social media would bring this home to people, but it's got to start somewhere, and I don't know what'll do it. But movies have a potential. Since Dr. Strangelove, there was a movie The Day After that actually had an effect on Ronald Reagan. Particularly, he couldn't get out of bed the next day, he's reported. In his diary, he spent the day in bed after watching The Day After, which was about a nuclear war, the effects of it. And as I was just telling Noam, it came out in 1983 before anybody knew about nuclear winter, which was at the end of the year. So it didn't present that at all, sort of end of everything. But it showed the end of, a lot of life in the Midwest. And it did make a big effect. So I would say that, coming back to our subject here today anyway, I don't know of anything that has a bigger prospect of doing this than movies that might get to people, and television, social media, videos, this sort of thing. It would be great to see that.
So, is there a film of the Doomsday Machine in the works?
Not that I know of. But
Nothing sanctioned. Huh? Well, it would
Actually,
make
there are
an
people who are
interesting
talking about it.
documentary.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hope they do that. So, about the press, you mentioned watching the movies and watching how Nixon hated the press and talked so awful, and now with Trump, he has taken it kind of
That's
almost
why
to the next
movie,
level.
The Post is so timely. It shows a president at war with the press. And but remember, Nixon kept that pretty secret to himself. And what we have is very unusual here is Trump, who's not only letting out his anger at the press, which most presidents have felt at one time or another, but he's very open about it.
Right.
And he's doing something very strange for a Democratic leader. He is calling on people sort of not to believe anything they read in the mainstream press. Now that puts people like Noam and me in a peculiar position, because we've been saying for decades, don't believe everything you read, that's not the last word. I don't think we've been saying, at least I haven't been saying, don't believe a word, don't even take it into account. It's all fake news, there's nothing else. So when Trump criticizes the press, people like me who've been and Noam has written about propaganda machines, and ideology and so forth a great deal. And so he's trying to inoculate people being too credulous about the New York Times or whatever. But I'll have to ask him what he feels now when he hears Trump saying essentially what we've been saying to a certain extent. But when, don't believe anything. And it's really an almost hypnotic kind of thing.
believe only what you see from me, pay no attention to anything else. And it's a very strange situation. So it's very dangerous, I would say. And Trump, of course, with his, I'm not even sure that he lies about important things more than other presidents have, amazingly enough. But he lies about everything, trivial things. He does things that other presidents wouldn't do, and that's say things that are manifestly untrue and can be disproven quickly, before the news cycle is over. It doesn't matter to him. He apparently doesn't make any difference. I can tell you that when I've been in many sessions in the government, when people say, how do we respond to this? What do we say about this? And they never start from the notion, well, here's the facts, here's the truth. Because if you seem to be bound to that, you wouldn't be trustworthy as to what we're doing here. You can always do better than the truth. So the question is, what do we want people to believe that we believe? What do we want them to hear? And so forth. But a consideration always is, can that be quickly disproven? Or something? Let's not say something that will make a fool of us. So he doesn't care about that at all. And was his crowd bigger than Obama's? So you look at the pictures. It seems to be that the crowd in this side is very much bigger than the crowd on that side. But no, he says it over and over. He's still saying my crowd was bigger. So my button is bigger. He says to Kim Jong-un. And so there's no picture of that because there actually is no button for either of them. So it's metaphorical, but his button is bigger. Believe me, So it's strange. It is a mood against fact, against the idea of truth, against the idea of evidence, basically. It's anti-scientific, of course, and it's not that science has the last word about a lot of things, but he's in effect saying, don't pay any attention to any of that, and in the way of evidence or anything like that, just what they want to believe. It's a strange situation and an ominous one, because we are facing the fact that ignorance on these points is deadly, and not only to ourselves but to life on Earth.
So about whistleblowers, why do you think there hasn't been? I mean, you were in a situation where you were inside. You knew what was going on. You were in the Department of Defense. You were at the RAND Corporation. You were in the military. You knew you had top secret clearance. You knew. And then at some point when you were exposed to a young man who said he was willing to go to prison, you felt you had a revelation and decided that you would take that you would turn against the war and expose the lies. You had that experience. Do you think there's any hope that, I mean, there's a lot of people who are in the position you were in that could do what you did and reveal.
Yeah.
Why aren't they doing that?
Well, I was just thinking, we were talking about this the other day, and I was thinking, by now I would have hoped, it's 40 years since the Pentagon Papers, that there would be, I believe that putting out documents like that give the lies to government policy and expose the dangers and the lies and so forth, it should be commonplace to reveal those, actually. And if that happened, how often should there be a Pentagon Papers coming out? Well, almost as often as they make studies, but ideally, like once a month or once a year or something like that, or in the world, Well, it doesn't happen. And so I've had to think a lot about why that was. And of course, putting me on trial, facing 115 years, was meant to be a dampener, and discourage people a bit. And undoubtedly it did that. But then I didn't go to prison. So by a miracle, but nevertheless, here I was. And so it showed it was possible to do this and not suffer for it. Say unlikely, but possible. It was clear why not a whole lot of people would do that. But I did think some should be doing it, and I've been talking about this for a long time. And I had to face the fact, almost 40 years went by, and I didn't see anything like that, because people leak all the time. That's very useful, very important, but they do it without evidence, without documents, or maybe a page or two of documents, not enough to make the case. Not until Chelsea Manning. And then when I saw that she'd put out, with the help of digital ability now, much more than I had,
and then Snowden even far more 3 years later. That, well, this is what I was talking about for 40 years. But it took 40 years. So is it possible? Yes, they did it. But, you know, Snowden was in 2013, and he got many resolutions in Congress about what the crimes that National Security Agency was doing at the orders of the president. Massive surveillance, ripping up the Fourth Amendment totally, and listening to everybody. Basically a Big Brother Stasi kind of operation. Totally unconstitutional, illegal. Has it actually changed? Hard to say. We'll see whether it changes. There have been some constraints on it, but not clearly very much. But did he get enough discussion? Yes, definitely. So why hasn't there been another Snowden since then? Well, he's in permanent exile. And he's in Russia because he is caught there when they took his passport away en route to Latin America, where he'd rather be, actually. He finds Russia cold, actually. And would rather be in Europe or rather be in Latin America. No nation wants to make waves with the United States to the extent of giving him asylum. I heard that in Germany there were many signs in windows say there is a bed in German. There is a bed here for Edward Snowden, and the Parliament actually voted to have him come and testify at one point. But say give him asylum? No. So nowhere in the world is willing yet to stand up to the United States and give him asylum. Now Julian Assange has been given asylum, but inside an embassy. He's been in one room for 6 years. Well, that doesn't encourage people too much. Nevertheless, with these stakes, shouldn't there be some people who would do what I finally did, or what they did, take a risk? I was in Vietnam. They didn't show those scenes here, but as a civilian, but I used my training as a Marine, company commander, platoon commander. I used my training to walk with troops. It's very common to see physical courage and courage for the team, willingness to kill yourself, to be blown up by a mine, as in Iraq, of course, all the time, or Afghanistan. And we don't think those people are crazy. You know, we don't, on the contrary, there are brave soldiers and so forth. But the point is, it seems easy to train, to get people to show very great physical courage in combat. And I say, I've seen it. Everybody, I'm sure people here have seen that. But what Bismarck called moral courage, or civil courage, civil courage, as Bismarck of all people said, that's very uncommon. And it turns out to be very uncommon. Can you train more people to do it or encourage them to do it? Well, I think the examples help. I would not have thought of giving the Pentagon Papers, which exposed me, I thought, to life in prison, without the example of young Americans who were on their way to prison, who were like me, only younger. And I could identify with them, and it was clearly the right thing for them to do. And I realized I could do that, and it was the right thing for me to do. I had to have that example. And they had examples of other people. 5,000 Americans went to prison for nonviolent resistance to the draft. Actually, 50,000 were exposed to it in the courts, and even a larger number didn't cooperate with the draft system. So that's a part of our history that I think if it were known more and focused on more, could encourage people. It's part of our history. We should know more. I was tremendously moved when I saw in a video from Moscow, Ed Snowden said, "Without Ellsberg, no Snowden." And what he was referring to was a movie.
Right.
Was the, as you mentioned, the most dangerous man in America. It wasn't the deciding point, but he said it strengthened him. He thought without seeing that, he would not have decided to do what he did do, which was to put that out. So I would hope that somehow, well, what we're doing tonight in a way, can expose people to the possibility of taking a risk to avert a war, you know, to save a war's worth of lives, or to save the planet from climate disruption. Of course it's worth doing that, if you think about it.
Well, one ongoing theme in the questions from the audience is, what do we do? What can we do? You talk about changing course, or is there anything we can do?
Okay. First of all, this year, first of all, I would like people to be saying, it isn't happening, but I would like people to be saying to their Congress people on breaks and everything else. By the way, what they did say in 2013, when this is, people interpret this very differently, and Trump's, well, here's what it is. Obama had said that there was a red line, that he could not be crossed. An ambiguous case of gas attack arises in Syria. And actually, to this day, I bet many people here haven't heard this, but the Defense Department has said recently, there still don't have, I think it was Mattis, actually say, we don't have definite evidence of who caused the gas attack back then. It was ambiguous. But it was charged as being Assad, so as having crossed the red line that Obama had said would cause him to attack Syria. And as I say, attacking Syria is playing with attacking Russians. Mm-hmm. And there is a nuclear state I do not want to be in armed conflict with. And that has nothing to do with what I think of Putin or the Russian state. Kim Jong-un, it goes without saying, is a tyrant, among other things. It's a long history there, but it's a tyrannical regime, which I said I do not want armed conflict with that regime, with the U.S. Same, I would say, about Russia and Syria. There are now 5 nuclear states out of 9. There are 9 states that have nuclear weapons. 5 of them are dropping bombs or shooting in Syria. 5 of 9. Britain, U.S., France, Russia, and Israel. That is a tinderbox that, for the world, that is incredible that people are accepting, as all the people in those countries are accepting that. Okay, in 2013, something happened that was another one of those miracles as far as I was concerned. Congressmen came back for the break, congresspersons, and they heard in mass from citizens, we don't want war with Syria. We don't want the president to carry out, and these are people who had voted for Obama, many of them. We don't want Obama to carry out that threat. And by the way, I'm in contact with many activist groups. That was not organized, to my knowledge. There was not a big movement to do this. People just spontaneously said, we don't want another war in the Middle East. And Congress heard that. Obama heard that. He found he had no support in Congress for going ahead here. The British Parliament, by the way, had recently voted against participating in the war that they're now doing in Syria. And that was in Obama's mind. And then Putin came through with the offer to get rid of Assad's gas, chemical weapons, totally, which the question is now being raised whether he did that because of the recent question, except we don't know. It is definitely ambiguous as to what that status, who did it, what was the gas, and so forth. Anyway, there was a case where people talking to their Congress representatives made an immense immediate difference. And afterwards, I had to ask, I would never have foreseen that would happen. It seems that people had really gotten sick of the Libya invasion earlier, which again, an illegal incursion in various ways, which Obama, who I supported strongly in two elections, Obama had not consulted with Congress in the slightest. It was totally unconstitutional intervention. And he got a Harold Coe, a former dean of a law school, to say, well, we don't have to go to Congress because it's not a war, it's not armed conflict. Why not? Because we don't have ground troops there. We are only dropping bombs and firing from helicopters and using drones and so forth. So Americans are not at risk, so it's not a war. There was no lawyer in the country would have supported that reasoning. But anyway, he went into Libya with disastrous effects, as we now see, and to this day. So, but meanwhile, at that time, people had sort of looked at that and they said, wait a minute, enough of this. So in 2013, we didn't go to war with Syria, which I'm glad about. And by the way, which Trump at that time, if I'm not, am I right, Mark? I think he applauded that. He said we shouldn't be attacking Syria. He said that before the election this time. So, okay, when you asked me, there's an example right now. We should not be at war with North Korea, whether the summit succeeds or fails. There should be that is in my opinion, but that is what I would say. They should hear that word. And second, in this election, I would say it is essential that Democrats take the House and preferably the Senate, and that deserves great effort to achieve, and that is not a way of saying Democrats are wonderful. They're not wonderful. This expansion of nuclear weapons occurred under all the administrations, Democrat, Republican, both. The climate is going to hell, and that's not a rhetorical expression, under both parties. But one is worse than the other. That's very clear. We've got two very inadequate parties in terms of these major issues, but one is very much worse than the other. And I would say that it's really essential, in my opinion, and I say that not knowing how many Republicans or Trump supporters there may be in this House, and there may well be a lot of Democratic critics, which I am one, I would say. But I have no hesitation to say that's essential. Given that, there could be pressure for hearings on nuclear winter and on climate that have never been held under Democrats or Republicans. There's never been a hearing on any of the stuff I've talked about today. Nothing. And so can we count on the Democrats to do that if they control the House? No. And they won't run on it. But I believe they are incomparably more open to pressure on this subject than the Republicans who refuse to admit that there is a climate problem, or that there's any problem with nuclear weapons. So there is something right very big, and that applies to 2020 as well. And both things apply. You have to get Democrats in there, in my opinion. They have to be different Democrats from what we've seen in the past, on the whole, because those didn't do the job. And we have to have pressure on them that they haven't felt in the past since the Vietnam movement or the Freeze movement and other movements. There have been movements, but we don't see them now. There is a climate movement. There's the young people are now working on gun control, on that, because they're directly threatened. Well, the arguments of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, are almost identical to the arguments of the military-industrial complex. We're making you safe. Don't worry about the weapons. It's whether bad guys have them or good guys. Doesn't matter how many we have. It doesn't matter that if we get more, they get more, and then we get more, and so forth. Actually, it's better than not mattering, because when they get more, we get to get more, and there are profits in that. As for the NRA, so what is fueling all this in both cases? I just mentioned this because some young people asked me last night, could possibly young people be mobilized on this? I said, well, it's unlikely, actually. They have other things to worry about, and they're unlikely to get them on the nuclear issue. But it occurred to me to make this point that I just have. However, it's worth planting the notion in their minds that the world is threatened by nuclear guns, as it is by guns in the hands of police who aren't on adequate regulation, and by terrorists who pick up. Look, the question, did I just hear that bump stocks? What has happened on bump stocks? One thing or the other, the things that make automatic weapons out of non-automatic weapons, semi-automatic weapons. You can't make the slightest argument in favor of those things. They're having tremendous trouble getting a ban on those in states and in Congress. Well, wait a minute. To say that those are for hunting, we're kidding, right? But bump stocks, of course, should be banned, like ICBMs. Exactly. See, they're both tremendously dangerous, and there is no legitimate argument in favor of them. And all it requires is to oppose very powerful corporations who make profits building these things. By the way, I had somehow did I have the impression that there was going to be a conversation between Noam and me, but not now.
Not tonight.
Not apparently.
That was last night.
Okay. Okay, right. I didn't get it.
Sorry. Sorry for that misunderstanding. So, what do you make of the relationship between Trump and Russia? Without knowing where it comes from, it's kind of good.
Well, look, I think the circumstantial evidence that, first, the evidence goes beyond circumstantial, apparently, that Russia tried or did efforts to intervene in the election, to affect through social media and other means. And that's very easy to understand why they would. We do that all the time. Everybody does it to each other's elections to the extent they can, to a large extent. We certainly have done it in Russia against Putin, and he certainly took that personally against Hillary from 2009 and 2011, and retaliated. I mean, he wanted to retaliate. Now, I have heard that the support for Trump in Russia among people informed in political people and Putin was very evident. There was no secret about that. Did it have any effect? Nobody seems to know that yet. I haven't seen studies that are very convincing about whether that had any effect. Was there collusion? Well, we know there was a lot more contact than they admitted at first, and that they kept it secret as much as possible. And is Trump capable of colluding? I mean, are we kidding here at this point? So Trump says, no collusion, no collusion. Well, I don't think that's the last word, actually, on that factor. But supposing, by the way, there was collusion, what should we... Oh, by the way, let me jump ahead to one other thing about Trump and Russia. For some reason, Trump doesn't want war with Russia, nor do I. And he doesn't even want a Cold War with Russia. He's very resistant to it. I really don't want a Cold War with Russia, because the essence of Cold War is we can't negotiate with these people. We can't find ways to collaborate with them. They are evil, they're demonic, so forth. There are many problems in the world that demand cooperation with Russia. There aren't a whole lot that demand cooperation with North Korea, for example. There's a difference. But with Russia, yes. There are many things where we need to cooperate, as with China. And what gets in the way of that is possibly dangerous, I think, and harmful. So that is the one point on which I could say I agreed with Trump on that point. And indeed, Hillary Clinton was definitely pushing in a Cold War direction, and for the armaments and so forth, as was Trump on the armaments. But on a Cold War, it was very evident in Ukraine and Syria. She was actually, by the way, this is someone now that I supported very strongly against Trump. We're talking now about personal here. There was no question in my mind. I did not want Trump to win. I wanted Hillary Clinton. Those were the two choices that I saw. And I mean, that were the case, I would like to say. So having supported her, I was nevertheless very worried about her campaign proposals to have a no-fly zone in Syria, which would quickly involve her in considering whether or not to shoot down Russian planes. And I thought that was very dangerous. And I think that had she been elected, which I would have preferred and would still prefer, we would have to be mobilizing against war with Russia in Syria. So it was, that was one point on which I supported Trump. Now, why is Trump taking this view that I agree with? Because he's sane? Well, that's not the first answer that comes to mind somehow. And he doesn't show it on any other issue that I can think of. Is he being blackmailed? I don't find that hard to imagine. Being bribed in terms of money laundering between his family and Russian oligarchs and mafia, very plausible, I find that. I frankly don't care as much about the reasons. I like that policy, actually, which isn't to say I want him to be a serf, indebted to Russians. But in other words, I'm saying it's a little complicated there. But supposing the worst, that because because the Russians had blackmail on him, there was collusion that affected an election. I happen to know some precedents for that. In 1968, Richard Nixon, and we now know by his direction, that's only come out in the last year and a half, but his people were talking to Bouiziam, the ambassador from Vietnam, who I knew actually, representing President Thieu. Humphrey had been subjected to Lyndon Johnson for the campaign, was not willing to call for an end to the bombing because Johnson would have disowned him. In September, so he was way behind Nixon, who said, we will end the war with honor. He didn't explain what honor was, but it sounded good. And Humphrey was way behind him. In September, Hubert Humphrey, who, by the way, I've never mentioned this, but Humphrey had asked me to work for him in the campaign on Vietnam, and I didn't do it for various reasons. But Humphrey in September broke with Johnson on this point and made a provisional motion about ending the bombing, very tentative. His popularity began to rise rapidly, day by day, and till he was within sight of Nixon. At this point, LBJ announced that he was going to end the bombing. He was going to end the bombing and of North Vietnam because they were going to have peace negotiations in Paris. They'd been negotiating about this all year, about the size of the table and where it would be. And so, but now he said there's going to be negotiations. Thieu will come there and represent on one side of the table the government of Saigon. There's going to be peace, negotiations. And Humphrey's poll then rose right up and was virtually even with Nixon and on the way up. When Thieu announced days before the election, I'm not coming to Paris. No negotiations. Humphrey flattened out, no more, and Nixon won by a hair's breadth, less than 500,000 votes. Now what we now know is that Nixon had been telling Thieu during this month, don't go to Paris, as he put it to H.R. Haldeman, which came out only a year and a half ago, derail those negotiations. Having said to Johnson on the phone, of course I won't interfere with the negotiations. Of course I want them to be a success. I couldn't possibly do what you are accusing me of doing. Now, why was Johnson accusing him? Because he had FBI warrantless wiretaps of the Vietnamese embassy, of Bouiziam, and the talks by the Republicans to Anna Chennault, the widow of the Flying Tiger, General Chennault during the war, who was a representative of the China lobby and an intermediary with Thieu, and had been telling Chennault to tell Thieu, don't go to Paris. No negotiations. You will get a better deal from us. Okay? So LBJ said to Everett Dirksen, the Republican minority leader, this is treason. And Dirksen said, I know, it's very bad. They didn't have proof that Nixon himself was behind it, and now they do. But they didn't at that point. Johnson chose not to reveal the warrantless wiretaps as illegal, and Humphrey lost the election. Thieu said to a close acquaintance of mine, who was a close acquaintance of his, Tran Nhut Chow, I elected Nixon. 3 words. And he had elected Nixon. Now, what that meant was, I don't think the FBI were the only ones who had those wiretaps, and we now have the transcripts of those. Thieu had those wiretaps, I would say, and could have revealed them at any time. Thieu had blackmail on Nixon for the next, as long as Nixon was in. That explains to me an otherwise very peculiar aspect of the Vietnam War. In the negotiations with the North and Nixon, he was absolutely adamant that Thieu must be in the government, must be the ruler of any, even if there were a coalition. Thieu was against a coalition. The North was for a coalition, but it must exclude Thieu. So why was Tew the sticking point? By the way, let me say very bluntly, something that I doubt if you would have heard for anybody else. I think 20,000 more Americans died and were put on that Vietnam memorial to keep Tew in office. Now that comes just from the record of the negotiations. But why was that so essential to Nixon? Well, we didn't know at the time. Nobody knew. I think he couldn't give up Tew, and they had to stay there because Tew basically could have blackmailed him at any point by revealing that he had swung an election collusively, and I wouldn't say treasonously because I'm very conscious that the Constitution defines treason very narrowly. Waging war against the United States, comma, or adhering to its enemies, giving them aid and comfort. I wouldn't say that Nixon was adhering to the enemies of the United States, but he was colluding with a foreign power to swing an election, actually. What Trump is accused
Sounds
of
familiar.
right now.
Yes.
Right now. And it not only swung the election, but I think it prolonged the Vietnam War by many years, till 75 actually, and when by a miracle other crimes of Nixon were revealed. Then years later, not to go into the whole story, the October surprise issue in 1980, where the Iranians were persuaded not to release the prisoners to President Carter, they would do better under Reagan. And that issue was crucial to the election, which in that case was a narrow election, and the Iranians released the prisoners, announced the release as Reagan raised his hand for the oath, not 5 minutes earlier, not under the Carter administration. In other words, this is not to say this is an okay thing. It's to say this is American democracy as it exists. This is actually existing American democracy, which involves collusion with foreign governments at the cost of very large numbers of American lives, this, and that. That means we do need different people in Congress and in the government than we've had. We need more knowledge of what's going on behind our backs in what amounts to a covert empire, in my opinion, an empire that we deny as an empire. We deny what we're doing to keep it, our hegemony in various places. And we do that with the collusion of people in Congress, people in the press, and is challenged essentially by whistleblowers. So we need more whistleblowers.
Yes.
And
I'm going to have to wrap this up because we've got a Kurosawa film starting in here pretty soon. But I want to ask you one last question, which has been asked, I think, 2 or 3 different people in the audience. How do you sleep at night? And do you have any advice for us?
well, since I didn't release the nuclear material which got lost by Tropical Storm Doria in 1971, and it has meant, I wanted it out, but it has meant that I sleep next to my wife for the last 40 years instead of in prison.
Good.
So she's happy about that, and I'm happy about that. And I recommend the comparable kind of thing to everyone, to cling to your loved ones.
Oh, that's lovely. That's great. Thank you, Dr. Ellsberg. It's been an absolute honor.